The word translated as blessed in every English Bible you have ever held, Matthew 5:3 through Matthew 5:11, does not mean blessed. The man who changed it was Jerome of Stridon, working under papal commission in 382 AD, and the Latin word he chose, Beatus, collapsed an entire architecture of Greek meaning into a single religious syllable that the Church has been repeating, without examination. For 1600 years, Jerome was not careless. He was not malicious. He was working under the direct authority of Pope Damasus I, under institutional pressure to produce a unified Latin Bible that could stabilize a fracturing Roman Empire that had, only decades earlier, adopted Christianity as its official religion. Precision was not always the priority. Unity was, accessibility was, and the choice he made, translating Makarios as Beatus, was defensible in the narrow sense that both words gestured towards something favorable. But defensible is not the same as accurate, and the gap between what Jerome wrote and what Matthew wrote is not a minor variance in synonym selection. It is the difference between an entire theology of waiting and a practice of immediate present tense recognition. That gap has shaped every sermon, every funeral reading, every cross-stitched wall hanging. Every moment you have sat in a pew and heard these words and felt, without being able to name why, that something was slightly off. You have heard the Beatitudes your whole life. You have heard them read at funerals and printed on bookmark cards, and recited in the particular slow cadence that ministers seem to inherit from one another across generations, as if the words themselves require a certain heaviness to land correctly. You have heard them at confirmations and ordinations and Christmas Eve services, and in the background of films set in churches, and somewhere in your memory they live alongside candle smoke and wooden pews, and the quality of silence that a room achieves when it is collectively trying to be holy. The teaching you received went something like this. Jesus was looking at a crowd of suffering people, poor people, mourning people, meek and persecuted people, and he was telling them to take heart because their suffering had been noticed. God sees the grieving person and marks them for comfort. God sees the meek person and reserves the earth for them. God sees the person being persecuted for righteousness and logs a credit in their heavenly account. The Beatitudes, as most of us received them, were a divine acknowledgement of suffering coupled with a promise of future compensation. Hold on. Endure. Stay humble. The blessing is coming, though it may not arrive before death. That framework had a particular emotional texture to it, and you know what it felt like from the inside. There was something comforting about it in the moments when life was genuinely hard. The idea that your pain was not invisible, that something larger than yourself had registered what you were going through and had something planned in response. And there was also, if you were honest with yourself, something subtly exhausting about it, because it positioned you permanently in a posture of waiting. The blessing was always in the future. The reward was always on the other side of something, the other side of death, the other side of sufficient suffering, the other side of a level of meekness you were never quite sure you had reached. The Beatitudes, received this way, were a spiritual promissory note. The payment date was unclear and the amount was unspecified, but you were told to trust the institution holding the note. This is not a fringe reading of the text. This is the mainstream reading. It is the reading that appears in virtually every major commentary, every seminary curriculum, every Sunday school lesson written in the last 1,000 years of Western Christianity. The tradition built on this reading is vast and old and has produced genuine saints. It comforted people in concentration camps. It sustained people through famines and plagues and the particular grief of outliving your children. The traditional reading has done real work in human lives, and to say that plainly before transcending it is not weakness, it is honesty. That reading is incomplete. It is incomplete because it rests entirely on Jerome's Latin word beatus, and beatus is not what Matthew wrote. Matthew wrote Makarios, and Makarios does not describe a future state you are waiting to receive. It describes a present condition you are already in, whether you recognize it or not.
The Greek word is Makarios, Strong's number G3107. In the plural form that Matthew uses at the opening of each beatitude, it appears as Makarioi. This is one of the most common words in the entire Greek New Testament. It appears 50 times across the Gospels, the letters, and Revelation, and it has been consistently mistranslated in every major English version because every major English version ultimately traces its theological vocabulary back to Jerome's Latin and not to the Greek it was translating. Tyer's Greek lexicon, the standard scholarly reference for New Testament Greek, defines Makarios as supremely blessed, fortunate, well off, to be envied. Pay attention to that last phrase. To be envied. Not to be pitied. Not to be admired for your suffering. To be envied, which implies that the person described is visibly in possession of something others want. The Makarios person is not a patient sufferer waiting for a reward. The Makarios person has something right now that the observer recognizes as desirable. The Helps Word Studies definition takes it further, rendering Makarios as describing someone who is fully satisfied because they are in God's care and therefore experience His grace. Note the present tense of that definition. Fully satisfied. Not will be satisfied. Not is on track to be satisfied, pending sufficient suffering. Fully satisfied, present tense, because of a present condition of care. Helps then traces the word to its classical root, a root meaning large or extended, and describes it as the state of one who is in God's care and is satisfied with what He has given. The completeness is intrinsic. The satisfaction is not earned. It is recognized. But to understand the full depth of what Matthew was doing with this word, you have to go back further than the New Testament. You have to go back to Homer. In Homer's Iliad, composed approximately 8 centuries before Matthew wrote his Gospel, Makarios is used to describe the condition of the gods. Not because the gods had been approved of by a higher authority. There was no higher authority above the Greek gods. Not because the gods had suffered well and were receiving their reward, but because the gods existed in a state of completeness. Nothing essential was missing from them. They were not waiting for anything. They were not hoping for anything. They simply were, in the full, extended, undiminished sense of the word. And that condition of being fully what they were, without deficit, without waiting, without dependence on external validation, was Makarios. The word, in its oldest usage, described an ontological state, not an emotional one, not a religious one, a state of being in which the essential nature of the thing is intact and whole. When Matthew chose this word, and he chose it deliberately in a language that offered him many alternatives, he was reaching for this full range of meaning. He was not reaching for a word that meant divine approval. He was not reaching for a word that meant future reward. He was reaching for a word that the educated members of his audience who knew their Greek philosophy and their Greek literature would recognize immediately as pointing at something intrinsic, something present, something already true about the person being described. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, completed around 250 BC in Alexandria. The translation that Matthew quotes directly and repeatedly throughout his entire Gospel uses Makarios as its translation for the Hebrew word ashre. This is critical. The Hebrew ashe comes from a root meaning to go straight, to go forward, to be honest in one's movement. The Gesenius Hebrew lexicon describes it as pointing to a state of well-being that is the consequence of right-ordered movement through life, not a reward granted from outside, but a natural consequence of living in alignment with what is actually real. When Matthew reaches for Makarios to render the teaching of Jesus, he is consciously placing that teaching within a Hebrew wisdom tradition, where the word for this condition pointed at inner alignment and forward movement, and within a Greek philosophical tradition, where the word pointed at intrinsic completeness. Both traditions simultaneously point at something present, something internal, something that does not require an external authority to dispense it. Jerome sat down with that word and replaced it with beatus. In classical Latin, beatus carries a passive construction. You are beatus because something has been done to you. The state is received, not intrinsic. The source is external. You are the beneficiary of a blessing that originates somewhere else and arrives to you through a channel. Beatus is a beautiful Latin word. It gave us the word beatitude, which gave us the very title.
You are not the first person to notice this problem. The scholars who noticed it first paid significant prices for saying so, which tells you something about how much was at stake in keeping the mistranslation in place. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the early 3rd century, roughly 150 years before Jerome received his papal commission, produced a work called the Hexapla, a 6-column comparative analysis laying the Hebrew scriptures alongside multiple Greek translations simultaneously, so that the range of meaning in each word could be examined rather than collapsed into a single rendering. In his homilies on the Sermon on the Mount, Origen argued specifically and explicitly that Makarios in the Beatitudes described a present condition, not a future promise. He wrote that the person Jesus was describing was someone who had already arrived at something, not someone waiting for an arrival, not someone whose arrival was contingent on future suffering or divine approval, but someone currently in a state of inner completeness that the external circumstances of poverty and mourning and persecution could not, in fact, diminish. Origen was trying to hold the Greek word against the tendency of the growing institutional church to read all spiritual language as deferred promise. He failed, institutionally. His later writings were condemned at the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD, more than 200 years after his death, and significant portions of his work were ordered destroyed. What we have is what survived that condemnation, and what survived is still enough to see clearly that the problem with the translation of Makarios was visible to the most careful scholars from the very beginning. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD convened by Emperor Constantine primarily to resolve the Arian controversy, but operationally important for dozens of other reasons. Formalized the institutional architecture through which Christian interpretation would be standardized across the Roman Empire. The theological decisions made at Nicaea and in the councils that followed were not purely theological. They were also political, in the sense that they served the requirements of an institution consolidating authority across an enormous and fractious geography. A reading of Makarios that located the source of spiritual completeness inside the human being, available directly without institutional mediation, was theologically inconvenient for a church that had invested significantly in positioning itself as the necessary channel between God and the believer. The reading that placed the blessing in the future, to be received as a reward through the ministry of the church, was institutionally useful in a way that the Greek word's actual meaning simply was not. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how institutions work, how they have always worked, and how the theological vocabulary of any institution tends, over time, to drift toward readings that serve the institution's structural needs. Augustine of Hippo, writing his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount around 393 AD, the same decade Jerome completed the Vulgate, was perhaps the most sophisticated reader of the Beatitudes in the early church. And he noticed the interiority problem even while working within the constraints of Jerome's Latin. Augustine used the phrase interior homo, the inner man, repeatedly in his commentary, and he argued that the Beatitudes described a progression of inner states, not a list of separate external rewards. He was trying to restore the Greek word's sense of present tense inner completeness to a Latin text that had structurally removed it. His commentary is still assigned in seminaries. His insight was real and worth studying. But the cage of Jerome's Beatus shaped even his most careful thinking because the word he was working with was already passive, already pointing the reader outward and forward toward a blessing not yet received. And no amount of commentary on the inner man can fully overcome the grammar of the word you are commenting on. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the 15th century humanist scholar who produced the first printed critical edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516, the Novum Instrumentum, directly addressed the Makarios Beatus problem in his Analytikos, the scholarly footnotes he appended to his edition of the Greek text. Erasmus wrote explicitly that Beatus failed to capture the active, present tense quality of Makarios and that the Latin translation had reduced a description of a living condition to a statement of received status. He was denounced for his Greek New Testament by significant portions of the Catholic theological establishment who understood that a return to the Greek text threatened the authority of the Vulgate, and with it, the centuries of theological interpretation that had been built on Jerome's Latin choices. The Erasmian critique of Jerome's Makarios/Beatitudes translation was academically sound. It changed almost nothing in the tradition of English Bible translation that followed, because by 1516 the Beatitudes reading was too deeply embedded in the theological vocabulary of Western Christianity to be dislodged by a single scholar's annotation, however brilliant. The Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest substantially complete manuscript of the New Testament in existence, dated to the 4th century AD, discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery on the Sinai Peninsula, now held primarily at the British Library in London, renders Matthew 5-3 with the Greek Makaroi that every earlier manuscript tradition uses. There is no manuscript tradition in which Matthew writes blessed in the passive, externally received sense. There is no variant reading, no textual dispute, no fragment that challenges Makarios. The Greek is not ambiguous. The Greek is not uncertain. The Greek has been consistent across every manuscript for 2,000 years. The passive reading exists entirely in Jerome's Latin rendering and in the English translations that descended from it. Every English Bible that translates Makarios as blessed is inheriting a Latin choice, not a Greek one. There are moments in a life, they come without announcement, without preparation, and they cannot be manufactured on demand when everything you are carrying seems, for no articulable reason, to be exactly the right weight. You are not at the top of anything. You have not achieved the thing you are working toward. No external authority has confirmed that you are on the right track. Nothing in your circumstances has changed, but you are walking through an ordinary afternoon. The light is doing something on a wall, or the coffee is the exact right temperature, or you are in the middle of a sentence with someone you love, and you hear your own voice and something in it sounds like you, the real you, the one that exists before the performance of yourself begins each morning. And there is a moment, sometimes only a moment, where nothing is missing. Not nothing is wrong, things may still be wrong. The grief you are carrying may still be exactly as present as it was an hour ago. The difficulty you are navigating may be unchanged. But for a moment, the grief and the difficulty are inside something larger than themselves, and you are inside that larger thing. And a larger thing is, you do not have a word for it in English, which is part of what this entire examination is about. The larger thing is complete, not happy, not relieved, complete. That state has a name. It is Makarios. And Jesus opened his most concentrated, most carefully constructed teaching with the announcement that the people he was looking at, the poor, the grieving, the meek, the desperate for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted, were already in it. Not would be, already were. The Greek verb in Matthew 5-3 is present tense. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not theirs will be. Not theirs shall be, pending their behavior and God's review. Is. Present tense. The kingdom is already theirs. The completeness is already present. The Makarios condition is not the destination at the end of the road. It is the ground you are standing on right now, whether you are aware of it or not. The church translated that present tense into a future promise, handed it back to you wrapped in Jerome's Latin, and told you to be patient. What Jesus was actually doing was describing a reality that was already operative in the very people who seemed, by every external measure, to be furthest from anything that could be called blessed. That is not a theological adjustment. That is a fundamental reorientation of what the entire teaching is for.
Makarios appears 50 times in the New Testament. Each appearance is a different angle of light on the same truth. And together they build a picture of what the word actually means, that no single passage can give you alone. In Luke 1:45, Elizabeth says to Mary, in the moment of the visitation, when Mary has just arrived at Elizabeth's home carrying the news of the Annunciation, Makaria, she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her from the Lord. The feminine form of the word. Elizabeth is not delivering a blessing to Mary in the sense of conferring something Mary does not yet have. She is describing what Mary already is, in this moment, as a direct consequence of what is already happening inside her. The Greek grammar is unambiguous. Elizabeth is making an observation, not a pronouncement. She is saying, "Look at you. You are Makaria," because the believing is already happening in you, and the believing has already produced something that I, Elizabeth, can see from the outside. The completeness is visible. The Makarios state is not hidden. It is recognizable to an attentive observer, which is exactly what the classical Greek usage, to be envied, had always implied. This Luke passage is important because it demonstrates that Makarios is not exclusively connected to suffering or poverty. Mary, in this moment, is not poor in spirit. She is not mourning. She is not meek in the Proust sense of having laid down the project of domination. She is radiant with something, and Elizabeth names that something Makaria. The word is flexible enough to describe both the emptied person and the filled person, both the person in grief and the person in joy. Because what the word is pointing at is not the emotional content of the experience, but the quality of presence within it. The Makarios condition is what happens when a person is fully, completely, without reservation, inside their actual experience, whatever that experience is. It is the antithesis of the dissociated half-presence that characterizes most of ordinary human waking life. The state of being partially here and partially running a background process about whether you should be somewhere else, feeling something different, becoming someone better. In James 1:12, James writes, Makarios, the one who endures testing. The English translations almost universally render this as, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life." Read that English rendering carefully. It projects the Makarios condition into the future. When he has stood the test, he will receive. But look at the Greek. The word translated remains steadfast or endures is hupomeno, Strong's G5278. Hupomeno is a compound of hupo, under, and meno, to remain, to stay, to abide. It means literally, to stay under. Not to endure in the sense of white-knuckling your way through difficulty while wishing you were elsewhere. To stay under. To remain present beneath the weight of the experience, in contact with it, not fleeing it, not managing it from a safe distance, but underneath it with your full attention and your full being.
The Makarios condition in James 1:12 is not a reward for enduring pain. It is the description of what happens to a person who stops trying to escape their difficulty and instead stays under it, remains fully present inside it, in contact with it, allowing it to be exactly as large as it actually is. The completeness arises from the hupomeno, from the staying under, and the staying under is available right now in the middle of the difficulty, not at the end of it. James is not saying, endure this, and when you have endured it sufficiently, you will receive the Makarios state as a reward. James is saying, the person who stays under their difficulty, in the precise Greek sense of remaining present rather than fleeing, is already Makarios, because the staying under is itself the condition the word describes. This is a cross-reference that devastates the conventional reading of the Beatitudes, not by contradicting it, but by showing from an entirely different angle that the Makarios condition in the New Testament is consistently connected to presence rather than to reward, consistently pointing at something generated from within the person's relationship to their experience rather than dispensed from above in recognition of their performance. In Revelation 1-3, John writes, Makarios, the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and Makario, those who hear and who keep what is written in it. This usage is typically read as a conventional blessing attached to the book, a kind of theological endorsement that treats reading and hearing revelation as inherently meritorious acts that God will reward. But read it again with the full weight of the word. John is saying that the act of reading aloud, of taking the words into your body, forming them with your mouth, releasing them into the room, making them real in the physical world through your physical act of speaking them, produces the Makarios condition in the person doing it. Not in a future sense. In the act itself. The reading is the wholeness. The enactment of the meaning is the arrival at the meaning. There is no gap between the doing and the receiving because they are the same event. This third cross reference completes a pattern that is now unmistakable. In Mary's case, the Makarios condition is present because believing is already happening inside her. In James's case, the Makarios condition is present because staying under is already happening inside the person in difficulty. In John's case, the Makarios condition is present because the active enactment of meaning is already happening in the person who reads aloud. In every instance, the word describes a present tense quality of full engagement with reality. A state of being completely inside your actual experience, whatever it is, without reservation and without the dissociation of half-presence that characterizes the alternative. Now return to Matthew 5 and read the 8 Beatitudes with everything you now know. Makaroi hoi tokoi to pneumati. Complete are those whose spirit is in the condition of extreme poverty. Tokoi, Strong's G4434, comes from a root meaning to crouch or to cower, and in Greek usage described not modest poverty but the most extreme, destitute poverty, the poverty of someone who has absolutely nothing left, no resources, no reserves, nothing to defend. The person who is patakos in spirit is the person whose inner resources are entirely exhausted, who has stopped pretending, stopped performing adequacy, stopped maintaining the fiction of spiritual sufficiency. And Jesus says, that person is Makarios. Not will be, not can become, not is on the right track toward is. The completeness is present because the pretending has stopped. The inner poverty is honest, and honesty is itself the condition the word describes. Makaroi hoi pentauntes, complete are those who are mourning. Pentheo, Strong's G3996, describes not mild sadness but grief so acute and so total that it cannot be hidden. It is the word for grief that breaks through every social containment and refuses to be managed or presented in a form acceptable to the room. The person who is pentouts is not someone who has processed their grief appropriately and arrived at acceptance. They are someone whose grief is still raw, still visible, still ungovernable. And Jesus says that person is Makarios, not because grief is holy, not because suffering earns reward, but because the person fully inside their grief, not managing it, not apologizing for it, not pretending it is smaller than it is, has made contact with something real. The Makarios condition is what arrives when you stop lying about your own pain. Makaroi hoi praeus, complete are the meek. Praus, Strong's G4239, was Aristotle's word for the precise middle state between excessive anger and the inability to feel anger at all. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle described praeotes as the virtue of having exactly the right emotional response to each situation. Not too much force, not too little, not dominated by rage, not domesticated into passivity, but calibrated precisely to what is actually required. The person who is prauls has stopped needing to dominate their circumstances and their relationships as a way of managing their own inner state. They have laid down the project of control, not because control is wrong, but because they have discovered that the tight grip of the dominator is itself a form of poverty, a constant expenditure of energy that leaves the person exhausted and alone. And Jesus says, that person is Makarios. The earth belongs to them not as a political conquest, but as an accessible reality, because the person who has stopped dominating the earth is actually capable for the first time of receiving it. Here is where all of it lands together. The Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, is the longest continuous teaching of Jesus recorded in any gospel. Matthew structured it carefully. He placed it on a mountain evoking Moses on Sinai deliberately. He opens it not with instructions, but with 8 descriptions. Not 8 commands, not 8 conditions you must achieve. 8 recognitions of what is already true about specific kinds of people who are standing right in front of him. The traditional reading made the Beatitudes a threshold. Suffer enough, humble yourself enough, endure enough, demonstrate sufficient meekness and purity of heart, and eventually you cross the threshold into the blessed condition. That reading required an institution to manage the threshold, to tell you whether you had suffered sufficiently, whether your meekness was adequate, whether your persecution was the right kind. It positioned the church as the necessary intermediary between you and the state the word describes. But Makarios does not describe a threshold. It describes a recognition. Jesus is not telling the crowd what they need to achieve. He is telling them what they already are, and the precise conditions they are currently in, if they can stop long enough to see it. The poor in spirit are not on the way to the kingdom. The kingdom is already theirs. The mourning are not awaiting comfort. The comfort is already present in the fullness of the grief itself, in the honesty of the contact with what is real. The meek have not been promised the earth as a future inheritance. They already have access to the earth, right now, that the dominator, for all their force, can never reach. Matthew chose Makarios 8 times in a row because he was trying to give his readers access to something the English word blessed cannot carry. He was pointing at a present tense quality of inner completeness that exists not despite the conditions he is describing, but within them and because of them. Because poverty of spirit, and grief, and meekness and hunger, and persecution are all conditions in which the false self, the performed self, the self that is constantly managing its presentation and defending its adequacy, is most likely to give up and simply be what it is. And being what it is, without addition, without performance, without the constant energy expenditure of pretending, is the condition the word describes. Jerome's Beatus moved all of that into the future and handed it to you as a reason to be patient. The English translation inherited Jerome's Latin and never looked back at the Greek. Every Sunday school lesson, every funeral homily, every cross-stitched wall hanging carrying the Beatitudes in English is carrying a Latin theological framework dressed in Greek clothes. The Greek clothes belong to a different understanding entirely. The English never gave you access to this. What do you do with this? Not rhetorically, practically. You are a person living in ordinary time with ordinary difficulty, and the Greek word makarios is not a concept to understand and file away. It is a condition to inhabit, and because it is a present tense condition, something already available rather than something to be earned, the practice built from it is not about adding anything to your experience. It is about removing the obstruction to recognizing what is already there. This practice has 3 parts and takes between 3 and 5 minutes. You do not need a particular posture, a particular setting, a particular level of spiritual development, or any equipment. What you need is the willingness to stop performing normalcy for long enough to notice what is actually present. Name it. The first part of the practice is naming, not analyzing, not placing into a framework, not judging the experience as appropriate or inappropriate, proportionate or excessive. Simply naming what is present in your actual experience right now, without editing it toward acceptability. Begin with what is uncomfortable, because the uncomfortable thing is almost always the thing you are most actively refusing to be fully inside. If you are grieving something, a relationship, a version of yourself, a possibility you have had to give up, name the grief without the story about why you should be over it by now, or why it is not as bad as what other people go through, or why you are being self-indulgent to still feel it. Name the grief. Just the grief. Not the story around it, not the justification for it or against it. The grief itself in whatever shape it currently occupies your body. If you are poor in spirit, If your inner resources feel thin, if the tank is running below empty and has been for longer than you want to admit, name that without the shame that typically accompanies it in a culture that treats spiritual exhaustion as a personal failing. You are not failing. You are in one of the conditions Jesus specifically identified as the condition of Makarios. Name it plainly. I am depleted. My spirit is crouching low. My resources are exhausted. If you are carrying the kind of grief that cannot be hidden, the pentheo grief, the grief that breaks through the surface when you least want it to, in grocery stores and during ordinary conversations, the grief that refuses to stay in the container you have assigned it, name it without the apology that has become automatic, the apology for having feelings at a volume that makes other people uncomfortable. The pentheo grief is not a malfunction. It is a sign that something real is present. Name it. This is here, and it is large, and I am not going to pretend it is smaller than it is. You are not narrating your condition to another person. You are not performing self-awareness for an imagined observer. You are, in the privacy of your own attention, allowing the actual texture of your experience to have a name. This sounds trivially simple. It is not. A substantial portion of what we experience as psychological suffering is not the experience itself. It is the unrelenting effort to not have the experience the constant energy expenditure of pushing against what is actually present, managing it, containing it, reducing it to a size that feels safe to acknowledge. The naming stops that effort. Briefly, just long enough. Notice it. The second part of the practice is noticing that the experience you just named is happening inside something larger than itself. Not larger in a metaphysical sense that requires you to hold a particular belief. Larger in a simple, immediate, observable sense that you can verify in your own experience right now. Notice that you are breathing, not breath you are forcing or controlling, breath that is happening in your body whether you pay attention to it or not. Notice that you are aware, not aware in a heightened or special sense, simply aware, in the ordinary sense that you are here, present in this moment, noticing the content of your experience. That awareness, the awareness that is noticing the grief, or the depletion, or the crouching poverty of spirit, is not itself damaged by what it is noticing. The observer is intact. The observer is always intact. The grief is large and present and real, and the awareness that holds the grief is larger, not more powerful, not dominant over the grief, simply more spacious. The grief is inside it the way a storm is inside the sky. The sky is not the storm. The sky is large enough to hold the storm, and the storm moves through the sky without destroying it, and the sky is still there when the storm has passed, unchanged in its fundamental nature. You do not have to believe this. You have to notice it. Look for the observer. You will find it simply by looking. The act of looking for the observer is itself the observer. And when you find it, notice that it is intact. Notice that the part of you capable of observing your incompleteness is not itself incomplete. That intactness, that unchanged, undiminished quality of the awareness that holds whatever you are experiencing is Makarios. Not a metaphor for it. Not a philosophical approximation of it, the direct experience of it, available right now in the middle of whatever difficulty or depletion or grief is currently present in your life. Take 60 seconds with this, actual 60 seconds, which is longer than it feels when you read it. Hold the grief or the poverty of spirit with your full attention. Let it be exactly as large as it is. Do not diminish it. Do not try to neutralize it with the observation of the awareness that holds it, and simultaneously notice the awareness itself, both things at once. The experience and the one who is experiencing it, the storm in the sky. This is not a technique to make the difficult thing go away. It will not make the difficult thing go away, but the relationship to it shifts. Something that was the entire sky becomes weather inside it, and weather, however violent, eventually moves. Do this. The third part of the practice is a single sentence, spoken internally, derived directly from the Greek of Matthew 5-3. Not a prayer in the conventional sense. Not a commercial affirmation. not a mantra borrowed from another tradition, a statement of recognition in the present tense that places you directly inside the meaning of the Greek word you now understand. The Greek of Matthew 5-3 transliterated Makarioi hoi to choi to pneumati, hoti aton estin he basileia ton oranon, a literal rendering that preserves the present tense and the root meanings. Complete are those whose spirit is crouching low, because theirs, right now, is the reign of the heavens. The word translated kingdom, basileia, Strong's G 932, does not mean a physical territory or a future political state. It means reign, the active exercise of sovereignty. And the basileia ton oranon, the reign of the heavens, in Matthew's usage is consistently a present tense reality that is breaking into the world through the quality of life of specific kinds of people, not a future realm that opens after death. The person whose spirit is crouching low is not waiting for access to this reign. They have it, now, because the absence of the false self's defenses is precisely the condition in which the basileia becomes perceptible. Speak this sentence internally. I am complete in this emptiness, not as a claim you are trying to force yourself to believe, not as a positive thought pasted over a negative experience, as a statement you are holding next to your actual experience and testing for contact, probing whether at any level it has reality. Some days it will feel entirely false. On those days, do not force it. Simply hold it alongside what is present and let the two exist together. Some days, the sentence will land. Something in you will exhale at the sound of it, the way a tense muscle releases when exactly the right pressure is applied to exactly the right place. On those days, you're not having a spiritual experience in any special or elevated sense. You are making direct contact with what Matthew was describing when he wrote Makarios at the opening of the most important teaching in his gospel. Do not repeat the sentence more than 5 times in a single sitting. Repetition is not the mechanism here. Contact is. The syllables are not the thing. The recognition the syllables point at is the thing. One genuine moment of recognition is worth 1,000 repetitions of the words, and one genuine moment is entirely sufficient. If it lands once, let it land. Let the resonance move through you at whatever speed it needs to move. Do not immediately fill the space it opens with the next item on your mental agenda. For the second beatitude, Makarioi hoi pentounce, complete are those who mourn. The sentence that arises directly from the Greek is this: my grief is honest, and honest things are whole. This sentence is built from the root of pentheo, which describes grief that cannot be hidden, grief that is visible and ungovernable, and from the Greek understanding that the Makarios condition is consistently connected to the honest, unmanaged relationship with what is actually present. The person who is fully inside their grief, not managing it, not apologizing for it, not pretending it is proportionate or socially acceptable, has achieved in that grief a quality of honesty with reality that is itself the ground of the wholeness the word describes. The grief is not the problem. The grief is the path. Hold the sentence, my grief is honest, and honest things are whole. Let it either land or not land. Do not force it. Trust the word. Return to your life after this practice, not because the practice is over and the ordinary world is waiting, but because your life is where Makarios lives. Jesus did not deliver the Beatitudes at a retreat center to people who had cleared their schedules for spiritual development. He delivered them on a hillside to people who were going back to work afterward, to people with sick children and unpaid debts, and a Roman occupation that was going to get significantly worse before it got better. He described their condition as Makarios, not in spite of the difficulty of their circumstances, but without reference to it. The completeness he was pointing at was not circumstance dependent. It did not require favorable conditions. It did not require absence of pain. It required only the presence of the person fully inside their actual experience, without the energy expenditure of pretending to be somewhere else. That is what Jerome's Beatus missed. That is what 16 centuries of English translation missed. That is what every Sunday school lesson built on the passive tense promise of future reward missed. And that is what the Greek word, read in its full range of meaning, against its full background of classical usage and Hebrew wisdom tradition, gives back to you, not as a theological position to adopt, not as a new framework to replace the old one, but as a direct description of something that is available to you, in your actual life, in your actual difficulty, right now. Every time you read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit" from this point forward, you will hear the ghost of the Greek underneath the English, makarioi, present tense, already operative, already yours. Not a check waiting to clear, not a reward pending sufficient suffering, but a floor you are standing on right now, whether or not you have learned yet how to feel it beneath your feet. Makarios,